Here's a story you won't forget. It's about a girl who got tired of waiting and a man who was tired of running. It's about a lie that became a legend and a love that was paid for in blood and dust. Some stories are quiet. This isn't one of them. If you're ready, settle in. Because the wind on the San Pedro was about to learn a new name for trouble, and her name was June Mercer. The plan was crazy. June Mercer stood barefoot in the creek, the mud sucking at her toes, and she knew it was crazy. The water was so cold it felt like 1,000 tiny knives, a feeling she welcomed. It made her feel awake. It made her feel brave, and she was going to need every ounce of bravery she had. Because in a few minutes, a man was going to ride down that trail, a man named Luca, and she was going to force him to marry her. She wasn't a fool. She knew how it sounded. But this wasn't a game. This was survival. Her father, Jeb, a man more in love with a bottle than his own daughter, had been selling off their ranch piece by piece to feed his gambling habits. The whispers in town were getting louder. Soon there'd be nothing left but dust and debt. June needed a way out. Not an escape, but an anchor. And Luca was an anchor. He was Apache, a man who moved through the world like a shadow, his eyes holding the kind of stillness that comes from seeing too much. The townsfolk feared him, the ranchers ignored him, but June saw something else. She saw strength. She saw a man who didn't bend for anyone. He wouldn't be predictable. He wouldn't be easy. But he would be real. She'd seen him trade furs, his face unreadable. She'd seen him gentle a wounded horse, his hands sure and kind. She'd watched him from afar for months, this quiet, powerful man who never gave her a second glance. And that was the problem. Men like Luca didn't notice girls like her. Not unless you made them. So she'd make him. She stripped down to her thin cotton slip right there at the edge of the water. The morning air was sharp, raising goosebumps on her skin. She stepped into the current, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't have to wait long. The soft thud of hoofbeats echoed down the trail. He was coming. She didn't turn. She just listened, letting the sound grow closer, more real. A single horse, a steady gait. It was him. When he finally came around the bend of Yucas, he pulled his dun mare up short. His eyes, dark and sharp, flicked to her once, then away, as if he'd been burned. He turned his head, a gesture of respect, or maybe shock. June took a deep breath and walked out of the water. The slip clung to her like a second skin, the cold water making it nearly transparent in the morning light. Droplets slid down her arms and legs. She picked up the towel she'd left on a rock, but she didn't use it. Not yet. She let him see her. Let him see the desperation she wore like a shroud. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, with no room for argument. "You've seen me undressed," she said, locking her eyes with his. "By the old laws, that means you have to marry me." Lucas said nothing. His face was a mask of stone, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not desire, not anger. It was suspicion. A deep, cold suspicion that sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked at her, not like a woman, but like a trap that had just been sprung. "I meant you no harm," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'll ride on." "I know you meant no harm," June said, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. "I meant for you to see me." That got his attention. He finally turned to face her fully, his hand resting near the knife on his hip. He was studying her now, his gaze sharp and calculating. He wasn't looking at her body. He was looking for the lie. "This is a game to you?" he asked, his voice flat. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This is the only chance I have." He dismounted slowly, his boots landing softly in the dirt. He was taller than she'd realized, and he carried an aura of danger that was both terrifying and thrilling. He kept his distance, but his eyes were locked on hers, searching, probing. "A chance for what?" "To be seen," she whispered, "by someone who matters." He looked past her, toward the silent hills that had been his home long before her people ever set foot there. "I'm Apache," he said, the words a clear warning. "Your father, the men in town, they won't accept that." "My father doesn't own me," June shot back, a spark of anger in her voice. "And I don't care about the town." He looked back at her then, truly looked. He saw the fire in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He saw a woman who was cornered, but not broken. A woman who had just made the most reckless gamble of her life. He let out a slow breath, the suspicion in his eyes warring with something else. Curiosity. I don't marry because a woman plays a trick on me, he said. Then don't call it marriage, June replied, a small desperate smile touching her lips. Call it a bargain. Your protection for, well, for whatever I have left to give. He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. She expected him to laugh, to turn and ride away, and leave her shivering in her own foolishness. But he didn't. He gave a single sharp nod. All right, he said, his voice still low, but the hard edge was gone. I've noticed you. June finally wrapped the towel around herself, her body trembling with relief. The first part of her plan had worked. She'd gotten his attention. But as he mounted his horse and rode away, his path curving wider than usual, his gaze flicking back toward the creek, she had a sinking feeling. She hadn't just gotten his attention. She had awakened something dangerous, and she had no idea if she could control it. Luca didn't trust her, not for a second. He rode north, the sun climbing higher, but his mind was back at the creek. The girl, June, her story was a lie. He could smell it. People in this valley didn't work that way. A rancher's daughter didn't offer herself to an Apache man out of desperation. It was a setup. It had to be. Someone had put her up to it. Her father, maybe, or one of the other ranchers who wanted him gone. Lure him in, then cry foul. It was an old trick, one that usually ended with a rope over a tree branch. He'd seen it happen before. And yet, there was something in her eyes. A raw, brittle fear that felt real. He'd seen that look before too. In the eyes of a deer just before the kill. In the eyes of his own people as they were marched from their lands. It was the look of someone with nothing left to lose. Trick or not, he was curious. He needed to know her angle. So 2 days later, when she appeared at the edge of his trapping line, he wasn't surprised. He was ready. She carried a small basket, covered with a cloth. He watched her approach, his hand never far from his knife. I was looking for a stray sheep, she said, her voice a little breathless. She was a terrible liar. There are no sheep here, he said flatly. She bit her lip, then held out the basket. It's just bread and some jam. I made too much. He didn't move. He just stared at her, letting the silence hang in the air. He wanted to see her crack. He wanted to see the lie unravel. Why are you really here, June? He asked, his voice low and even. She flinched at his tone, but she held her ground. A small, sad smile touched her lips. Because I know you won't come to me. He had to admit she was bold. Foolish, but bold. He thought about turning her away, telling her to never come back. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But the question of her game, of what she truly wanted, gnawed at him. He needed to understand the trap before he could avoid it. He took the basket without a word, gave a curt nod, and melted back into the trees, leaving her standing alone. He didn't open it until he was miles away. The bread was still warm. It tasted of honey and salt. It tasted of a risk he shouldn't be taking. 3 days later, she found him again. This time he was cleaning a snare near a dry arroyo. He'd cut his arm on a thorn bush the day before, a long, shallow scratch. He hadn't bothered to clean it properly. I brought you something, she said, holding up a small tin. For your arm. He froze. How did she know? I saw the blood on your sleeve when you rode past my flock yesterday, she explained as if reading his mind. I noticed things. This time her words sent a chill down his spine. She was watching him, closely. Was she scouting his movements? Reporting back to someone? The suspicion returned, colder than before. But he let her approach. He let her dab the cool, fragrant salve on his arm. Her hands were calloused from work, but her touch was gentle. It smelled of lavender and something else. Something that reminded him of a time long before he learned to trust no one. People are going to talk if you keep this up, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Let them, she said softly. I'm not doing anything wrong. His eyes snapped to hers. Aren't you? She met his gaze without flinching. I'm just trying to survive, Luca. Same as you. The words hit him harder than a fist. He saw it again, that flicker of raw desperation in her eyes. Maybe she wasn't a trap. Maybe she was something far more dangerous. A woman in real trouble, and trouble had a way of spreading. He started expecting her after that. He hated it. He hated how she was slowly, quietly weaving herself into the fabric of his solitary life. She brought mended gloves. She brought a water skin. She never stayed long, never asked for anything, but she always found him, and she started asking questions. Not about his traps or the weather. She asked about where he was born, about his family. Questions no one had dared to ask him in years. He gave her nothing but short, clipped answers, but she kept asking. Then came the morning that changed everything. She showed up not with a gift, but with a rifle. It was an old, heavy Winchester, her father's by the look of it. She held it out to him, her expression serious. "Teach me how to use this," she said. He stared at the rifle, then at her. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of being afraid," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't want to kill anyone, but I want to know how not to die." He looked into her eyes and saw the truth. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a game. This was a plea. He took the rifle. They spent the day in a hidden canyon, the sharp crack of the gun echoing off the rocks. She was a natural. She listened, she learned, she didn't complain. By sunset, she could hit a pine log from 50 yards. She turned to him, her face flushed with pride, a real, genuine smile finally breaking through her fear. "That was just luck," he said, trying to keep his voice gruff. She tilted her head. "Or maybe," she said, her eyes sparkling, "it was just noticing." He almost smiled back. Almost. But as he watched her ride away that evening, a cold dread settled in his gut. He had let her in. He had taught her to defend herself. He had started to believe her. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that whatever trouble she was running from was now running straight toward him. The trouble arrived on a hot, dusty wind, 2 days before the 4th of July. June saw the wagon first, a rickety old army rig lurching down the trail. The man driving it was slumped over, a scarecrow in a dusty hat. Her blood ran cold. She knew that slump. She knew that hat. Jeb Mercer had come home. He climbed down from the wagon, a crooked, yellow-toothed grin spreading across his face. He looked worse than she remembered, thinner, dirtier. He smelled like stale whiskey and regret. "June Bug," he slurred, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Look at you, still playing shepherdess in this dust bowl." June didn't move. She stood by the gate, her hand gripping the rough wood until her knuckles turned white. "What do you want, Jeb?" she asked, her voice flat. "What, a father can't come visit his only girl?" He chuckled, but the sound was hollow. "Besides, I've got good news. I've got a plan. A real one this time." June had heard about his plans before. They always ended with something else being sold, something else being lost. That night she listened in stony silence as he laid it all out on the kitchen table, shuffling a deck of greasy cards as he spoke. He'd gotten into a game in Tucson, met a rich man named Russ Henley. "He's a big shot, June, owns half of Bisbee," Jeb said, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, feverish light. "And he's looking to expand. He needs land. He needs sheep. And he needs a good, respectable woman to run his new ranch house." June felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. "And?" Jeb wouldn't meet her eyes. He just kept shuffling the cards. "It's a good deal, Bug. A real good deal. He's a powerful man. He'll take care of you." "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He finally stopped shuffling. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. It was a bill of sale. For the ranch, for the sheep, for everything. But there was more. June's eyes scanned the cramped, spidery handwriting until she found the line that made her stop breathing. "And the hand of my daughter, June Mercer, in marriage, to seal the arrangement." She looked up at her father, her vision blurring with tears of rage. "You sold me." "It's not like that," he insisted, his voice rising. "It's an arrangement, a good one. He's respectable." "He's a stranger," she screamed, shoving the chair back as she stood. "You traded me like livestock." "I had no choice," Jeb yelled back, his face red and blotchy. "He owns my debts, all of them. He was going to ruin me, June. So you let him ruin me instead? She choked out. The fight went out of him then. He slumped back in his chair, a broken man. He's coming in 2 days, he mumbled into his hands. He's already paid. He thinks it's a done deal. That night, June didn't sleep. She waited until the moon was high and her father's drunken snores filled the small house. Then she ran. She took nothing but a shawl, the knife Luca had sharpened for her, and the rifle he'd taught her to use. She didn't run toward town. She didn't run toward safety. She ran toward the only person who had ever looked at her and seen a survivor. She ran toward the mountains. She ran toward Luca. She found him at the edge of his clearing, a silent shadow stepping out from the pines as if he'd been waiting for her. She didn't have to say a word. He saw the terror in her eyes, the rifle gripped in her white-knuckled hands. She fell into his arms, the story tumbling out of her in a torrent of sobs and broken words. The sale. The man named Henley. The deal her father had made. He thinks he can just take me, she whispered, her face buried in his chest. He thinks I'm just a piece of property. Luca held her, his arms a circle of surprising warmth and strength. He was silent for a long time, just listening to the wind in the trees and the frantic beating of her heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was as cold and hard as granite. No one is taking you, he said. But what can we do? She cried, looking up at him, her eyes pleading. He'll have men with him. He's rich, powerful. Luca's gaze was fixed on the dark trail leading back toward the ranch, back toward the world that had betrayed her. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He can have the land, Luca said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. But he's not having you. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't suspicion or curiosity. It was possession, a fierce, protective fire that both thrilled and terrified her. From this moment on, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, you belong to these mountains. You belong with me. Russ Henley was a man who liked his arrangements tidy. He was a man of contracts and handshakes, a man who believed money could buy anything. Land, loyalty, women. It was all just a matter of finding the right price. When he rode up to the Mercer Ranch 2 days later, flanked by 2 hired guns with cold eyes and worn leather, he expected a simple transaction. He had the paper. He had the money. He expected the girl to be waiting, packed and ready. What he got was Luca. Luca stood in front of the small ranch house, a silent, immovable obstacle. He wasn't dressed for a fight. He just stood there, bow slung over one shoulder, rifle strapped to his back. His presence alone a declaration of war. June stood behind him on the porch, her father's rifle held steady in her hands. Henley scowled, dismounting from his horse. He was a big man, soft around the middle, with a face reddened by sun and expensive whiskey. There seems to be a misunderstanding here, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He waved the bill of sale in the air. I have a contract. The paper is for the land, Lucas said, his voice calm and even. You can have it. The girl is not on it. Henley laughed, a short, ugly sound. Oh, she's on it. An addendum, sealed with her father's signature. She's part of the deal. She is not a deal, Lucas said, his eyes never leaving Henley's. She is not for sale. The 2 men behind Henley shifted, their hands moving closer to their pistols. The air grew thick with tension. June's heart hammered against her ribs, but her grip on the rifle didn't waver. Henley's smile faded. He looked from Luca's unblinking stare to the determined set of June's jaw. And who are you to say? Her Apache pet? Luca didn't flinch. He took a half step forward, placing himself more firmly between Henley and June. His next words were quiet, but they carried across the dusty yard like a thunderclap. She's already mine. June's breath caught in her throat. He said it so simply, with such absolute certainty, that for a moment, even she believed it. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a statement of fact, a line drawn in the dust. Henley's face purpled with rage. He stared at Luca, then at June, his small eyes filled with a mixture of fury and disbelief. You're willing to die for that claim, boy? He spat. Luca's gaze was like ice. I've died for less. For a long, stretched moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the house. Henley looked at his 2 men. He looked at the rifle in June's hands and the deadly stillness of the man in front of her. He was a businessman, not a fool. He knew a bad investment when he saw one. He cursed a string of vile words and hauled himself back onto his horse. "This isn't over," he roared, pointing a fat finger at them. "I'll get the law. I'll get a bounty. You'll hang for this. Both of you." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men close behind, leaving a cloud of angry dust in their wake. As the dust settled, June lowered the rifle, her arms trembling. She looked at Luca, her heart filled with a terrifying mix of gratitude and fear. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered. "You shouldn't have lied for me." Luca turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. "It wasn't a lie," he said quietly. They left that night. They knew Henley would be back. He wasn't a man to let an insult or a bad investment go. He would bring the law, or men who acted like the law. The ranch was no longer a home, it was a trap. They rode east, away from the setting sun, following ancient trails that were little more than whispers on the land. Luca moved with a quiet urgency, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. June rode beside him, her past a burning ember at her back, her future an unknown wilderness ahead. For days they traveled through a harsh, beautiful landscape of red rock and pale green sage. They spoke little. Words felt unnecessary. Luca taught her how to read the land, how to find water, how to erase their tracks. He taught her how to listen to the silence. She was a fast learner. Fear was an excellent teacher. One night, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, shielded by an outcropping of rock, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Did you mean it?" she asked softly, not looking at him. "Back at the ranch, that I was yours." He didn't answer right away. He stared into the small flames, his face a landscape of shadows. "I meant," he said at last, his voice rough, "that I would not let him take you. You came to me for protection. I gave my word." She looked at him then, at his strong, silent profile against the firelight. "You never gave your word." He finally met her eyes, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I didn't have to." She leaned against him then, a small, involuntary movement. He didn't pull away. He didn't move at all. He just let her rest there, his stillness a silent promise. The fire crackled, spitting sparks into the vast, starry darkness. For the first time in her life, June felt the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of being truly, irrevocably lost. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone in it. The world had taken everything from her. Her home, her family, her name. But as she sat there under a blanket of stars with a hunted man by her side, she realized she had something new. Something she hadn't bargained for. She had a chance. The first bullet came without warning. It screamed past June's ear and slammed into the rock behind her, showering her with stone splinters. The shot cracked through the twilight stillness of Dry Creek Ridge, a brutal violation of their hard-won peace. They had been careless. After days on the run, a sliver of hope had begun to feel like safety. They'd found a secluded spot, a hollow protected by a twisted cedar, and for the first time, they had let their guard down. Luca reacted instantly. In one fluid motion, he shoved June flat to the ground behind the rocks and returned fire with his rifle. The world erupted into chaos. Horses whinnied in the darkness. Men shouted. More shots tore through the air, ripping bark from the cedar tree above them. "Split up! Box them in!" a voice yelled. It was Henley's. June fumbled for the pistol Luca had given her, her hands shaking so badly she could barely find the grip. "Stay low. Breathe through the fear." Luca's words echoed in her mind. He was a ghost in the twilight. One moment he was beside her, laying down covering fire. The next he was a blur, melting into the trees at the edge of their camp. She heard a grunt, a curse, and the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. Then silence, a terrifying, ringing silence. Suddenly he was back, his face grim in the moonlight. There was blood on his sleeve. "We run," he whispered, his voice tight. "Now." She didn't question him. She just followed. They sent their horses galloping off in the opposite direction, a desperate gambit to confuse their pursuers. Then they moved on foot, scrambling over thorn-choked hills and through dry creek beds, the sounds of the hunt fading behind them. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and terror. June's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept pace with him, fueled by pure adrenaline. Just before dawn, they stumbled upon an abandoned trapper's shelter, a dugout carved into the side of a shallow canyon. Luca scouted the area, then pulled her inside, collapsing the entrance behind them. They were safe. For now. In the flickering light of a match, she saw the blood. It wasn't just a smear on his sleeve. His entire left arm was a mess of torn flesh, a raw, ugly gash from a bullet that had grazed him from shoulder to elbow. "You're hurt," she gasped. "I've had worse," he said, his voice strained as he slumped against the dirt wall, his breathing ragged. She didn't waste time. She tore a strip from her petticoat and cleaned the wound as best she could, with water from their canteen. She slathered it with the last of her lavender salve. He bore the pain with a stoic silence that broke her heart. "You should have told me," she murmured, her hands gentle as she bandaged the wound. He managed a weak, grim smile. "You were busy running." They stayed hidden in that dark, earthy hole for 2 days. Luca drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, muttering words in a language she didn't understand. June watched over him, her fear a constant, cold companion. She rationed their water, kept watch at a crack in the dugout's door, and listened. Listened for the sound of horses, the sound of men. Listened for any sign that their borrowed time was up. On the second night, he cried out in his sleep, his good hand flailing. She was there in an instant, a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. "Shh," she whispered. "I'm here." His eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. "June," he rasped, "I dreamt. They took you." "No one took me," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here." His hand found hers in the darkness, his grip surprisingly strong. "You shouldn't be," he whispered, his voice filled with a raw guilt she didn't understand. "This is my fault. I brought this on you." "No," she said, her fingers tightening around his. "You saved me. I chose this. I chose you." He lapsed back into a fevered sleep, but he didn't let go of her hand. June sat there in the darkness, holding on to him, and realized a startling truth. She wasn't his prisoner. She wasn't his burden. She was his partner. In that small dark hole, surrounded by enemies, they were no longer a desperate girl and a wary outcast. They were two people fighting for the same thing, a future. By the third morning, the fever had broken. Luca was weak, but the iron will that had carried him through his whole life was back in his eyes. He was ready to move. They broke camp before sunrise, heading deeper into the mountains, into a wilderness so vast and unforgiving it felt like another country. As they traveled, something shifted between them. The silence was no longer born of caution, but of comfort. He taught her how to read the flight of birds, how to know when the weather was turning. She told him about her mother, about the small garden she used to keep, about a life that felt a million miles away. One evening by a fire, he told her about his sister. "Her name was Tiva," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She was 8. She used to sing to the stars. She believed they sang back." He paused, his gaze lost in the flames. "Soldiers came. They said we were being moved, for our own safety. She got sick on the trail, the cold. She never made it to the reservation." He fell silent, the weight of his old grief filling the space between them. For the first time, June saw the source of his stillness. It wasn't just caution. It was a wound that had never healed. She reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. Late on the 5th day, they crested a high ridge and looked down into a valley below. It was like nothing she had ever seen. A ribbon of a stream snaked through a meadow of green grass, lined with cottonwood trees. The valley was nestled between high stone walls, a hidden sanctuary protected on all sides. Luca stopped, his breath catching. "This is it," he said, a strange reverence in his voice. "What is it?" June asked. "A place they won't find us," he said. "A place where the trail ends." He looked at her then, and she saw a flicker of hope in his dark eyes, the first she had ever seen. He had not just been running away from Henley, he had been running to something, to this place. June stepped forward, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She looked down at the hidden valley, a place of impossible beauty and peace. Home wasn't a house you were born in. It wasn't a piece of paper with your name on it. Sometimes home was a person who stood between you and the fire. And sometimes it was the long, hard road you walked together to find a place to build a new one. The silence of the valley was a living thing. It was in the rustle of the cottonwood leaves, the gentle murmur of the stream, the distant call of a hawk circling high above the stone walls. For the first few weeks it felt unnatural, almost deafening, after the constant tension of the run. June found herself starting at shadows, her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol that was no longer on her hip. Luca was the same, his eyes always scanning the ridgeline, his body coiled and ready. But slowly, day by day, the valley worked its magic on them. The silence began to feel like a blanket, not a threat. The solitude began to feel like freedom, not a prison. They began to build a life. It started small. Luca reinforced the natural overhang of a rock face, building a lean-to from stripped branches and mud, creating a shelter that was both hidden and sturdy. June, remembering the stories her mother used to tell, found patches of wild mint for tea, yarrow for medicine, and tart berries that she boiled down into a thick, sweet jam. Their days fell into a simple, unspoken rhythm. He would hunt and track, his knowledge of the mountains providing them with meat and security. She would tend to their small camp, her practicality turning their rough shelter into a semblance of a home. She mended their torn clothes, planted a small, hopeful garden with a handful of seeds she'd carried in a pouch, and hummed old songs as she worked, her voice a quiet thread of warmth in the vast wilderness. The quiet between them changed too. It was no longer filled with the unspoken questions of strangers. It was filled with the easy understanding of two people who had seen the worst of each other and had chosen to stay. One evening, as he sat by the fire carving a piece of wood, she found herself just watching him, watching the sure, steady movement of his hands, the focused concentration on his face. He was creating something from nothing, a small, intricately carved bird. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, not looking up from his work. She smiled. "I was just thinking, this is the longest I've stayed in one place without being afraid." He paused his carving and looked up at her, his eyes dark in the firelight. "Are you happy here, June?" The question caught her off guard. It was so simple, so direct. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the debt, the fear, her father's sad, slow decay. She thought about the terror of the chase, the cold nights spent hiding, the constant threat of death. And then she looked around their small camp, at the shelter he had built, at the fire that kept them warm, at the silent, watchful man who had become her entire world. "I've never been happy before," she said, the admission a quiet revelation. "So I don't know what it feels like. But this feels like peace, and I think that might be better." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and went back to his carving. Later that night he finished it. It was a small, perfect hawk, its wings outstretched as if in flight. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, its smooth, polished wood warm in her palm. It was more than a gift. It was a promise of freedom. But the world has a long memory. And even in the most hidden valleys, the past has a way of catching up. It happened in a dusty little mining town called Cumberland Flats, a 2-day ride from their sanctuary. Their supplies were running low. They needed salt, flour, and thread. June had insisted on coming with him. "I'm not a ghost, Luca," she'd said. "I won't spend the rest of my life hiding." So they went together, disguised in borrowed coats and wide-brimmed hats, their heads down, their business brief. They were just leaving the general store, their saddlebags full, when a voice cut through the street noise like a rusty blade. "June? June Bug, is that you?" June froze, her blood turning to ice. Luca's hand immediately went to the knife on his belt. Standing in the doorway of the saloon, swaying slightly, was her father. Jeb Mercer looked like a ghost. His clothes were in tatters, his face was gaunt, and his eyes were bloodshot and hollow. He stared at her, then his gaze shifted to the dark, silent man standing beside her. A slow, bitter recognition dawned on his face. "So it's him," Jeb sneered, his voice thick with whiskey and self-pity. "The Apache you ran off with. I heard you were dead." "We're not," June said, her voice cold. "Could have had a rich man," Jeb spat, stumbling forward. Could have had a real life. Instead, you're living in the dirt with a half-breed outlaw. You sold me, Jeb, June said, her voice dangerously quiet. You signed a paper and handed me over like a sack of grain. I was trying to save you, he cried, his voice cracking. Save us both. By putting a price on my head? She shot back. By telling Henley that Luca was a kidnapper? By sending a posse after us to kill us? Jeb flinched, as if she'd slapped him. I didn't. Henley made me. He said it was the only way. He said there was an old grudge. Something about Luca's family. His words trailed off into a pathetic, drunken mumble. June stared at the broken man who had once been her father. She saw the lies, the weakness, the black hole of regret that had swallowed him whole. All the anger, all the hate she had been carrying for months suddenly drained away, leaving nothing but a vast, empty pity. She reached into her satchel, pulled out a loaf of the bread she had baked that morning, and held it out to him. He looked at the bread, then at her, his eyes filling with tears. June, he whispered. That's all I have left for you, she said softly. She turned and walked away without looking back. Luca fell into step beside her. They mounted their horses and rode out of town, leaving the ghost of Cumberland Flats behind them. That night, back in the safety of their valley, she finally cried. Not for the father she had lost, but for the girl she had been. The girl who had waited so long for a hero to save her. Luca held her, not speaking, just offering the solid, comforting weight of his presence. When the tears finally subsided, she looked up at him, her eyes clear. That story is over now, she said. He nodded, his hand gently stroking her hair. We'll write a new one, he said. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that he was right. Their story was just beginning. The first frost came early that year, painting the valley in silver and white. The cold snap was a warning. Winter in the mountains was not a gentle season. It was a test of strength, a battle for survival. For Luca and June, it became a forge, tempering their partnership into something unbreakable. They worked relentlessly. Luca, using skills passed down through generations, showed her how to build deadfall traps for small game and how to smoke the meat so it would last for months. He reinforced their shelter, packing the walls with mud and dried grass until it was snug and warm, a tiny fortress against the coming storms. June, using the quiet ingenuity that had kept her father's ranch afloat for so long, took charge of their supplies. She gathered pine nuts, dried the last of the berries, and meticulously patched their clothing, her stitches small and even, a testament to her fierce determination. They became a team, their movements flowing around each other in a seamless, unspoken dance. He would bring in firewood, she would have the fire roaring, she would prepare a meal, he would have the water fetched. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to read the language of a shared glance or a simple nod. The long, dark nights were a different kind of test. Trapped inside their small shelter by the howling wind and biting cold, there was nothing to do but talk. The stories they had started telling by the fire on the trail began to deepen, to fill in the empty spaces between them. He told her of his childhood, of a world of spirits and ancient laws, of the day it was all ripped away. He spoke of the reservation, a place of sickness and despair, and of his decision to leave, to live free in the mountains of his ancestors, even if it meant living alone. She told him of her mother, a woman who loved flowers and quiet evenings, and of the light that had gone out of their home when she died. She spoke of her father's slow, agonizing descent into bitterness, and of the crushing loneliness of her youth. In that small, warm space, surrounded by the vast frozen wilderness, they unpacked their scars, their griefs, their deepest fears. They discovered that they were not so different. Both had been abandoned. Both had been betrayed. Both knew what it was to be utterly alone. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, June was mending a tear in Luca's coat. Her fingers were numb with cold, but she worked on, her focus absolute. You know, she said quietly, not looking up from her work, when I first saw you, I was terrified of you. Luca, who was sharpening his knife by the fire, paused. Good or Asurni, he said. You should have been. She smiled. I thought you were like the mountains, hard and cold and dangerous. I am, he said, his voice low. No, she said, finally looking at him, her eyes soft in the firelight. You're not. The mountains don't care if you live or die. But you cared. He didn't reply, but a flicker of something warm and vulnerable, passed through his eyes before he looked away. A few nights later, it was his turn. She had woken from a nightmare, a silent scream caught in her throat, the images of Henley's men still vivid in her mind. Luca was instantly awake, his hand on her shoulder, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. It's all right, he whispered. You're safe. I was so scared, she choked out, her body still trembling. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. I know, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. When I saw you standing in that creek, so brave and so foolish, I thought you were a ghost, something sent to haunt me. Why? She whispered, her face buried in his chest. Because you look like hope, he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. And I had forgotten what hope looked like. The blizzard passed, the winter deepened, but inside their small shelter, something had thawed. The walls they had built around their hearts, the defenses they had honed over years of solitude and pain, began to crumble. It happened slowly, quietly, without words or declarations. It was in the way he would place a wildflower by her sleeping mat in the mornings. It was in the way she would save him the best piece of meat from the stew. It was in the way their hands would brush as they worked, a spark of warmth that lingered long after the touch. One evening, he presented her with a gift. It wasn't a carved bird this time. It was a ring, woven from strips of supple leather, with a single smooth red stone set in its center. A river stone, polished by years of rushing water. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. It was simple. It was imperfect. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She looked up at him, her eyes asking the question she didn't dare speak. He took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. In my mother's clan, he said, his voice soft, we did not have preachers or papers. A man and a woman chose each other. They built a home. They faced the winter together. That was the law. That was the vow. Tears welled in June's eyes, hot and sudden. She threw her arms around his neck, her heart so full it felt like it would burst. Yes, she whispered against his skin. Yes. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair. Outside, the winter winds howled their lonely song. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, two survivors, two outcasts, two lonely souls had finally, against all odds, found their way home. The vow had been made. The law had been honored. They had faced the winter together, and they had won. Spring came to the valley like a whispered promise. The snow retreated, the creeks swelled with meltwater, and tiny shoots of green pushed their way through the damp earth. The flower bulbs June had planted in a fit of desperate hope bloomed into a riot of delicate white bells and sunny yellow stars. She knelt beside them one morning, the sun warm on her back, and felt a sense of peace so profound it almost hurt. Their life, once a frantic scramble for survival, had settled into a gentle, flowing current. They were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. They expanded their garden, planting neat rows of beans and squash. Luca built a sturdy fence to keep the deer out. They even acquired a small flock of chickens, traded for with a wandering trapper in exchange for a few of Luca's expertly tanned pelts. The sound of their clucking was a cheerful, domestic counterpoint to the wild silence of the mountains. June found herself humming more often. Luca found himself smiling. The hard edges of their past were softening, worn smooth by the simple, steady rhythm of their days. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the high ridge overlooking their valley. Instantly, the old tension returned. Luca grabbed his rifle, his body going still and watchful. June's heart leaped into her throat. But the rider was alone, and he did not approach like an enemy. He was an old Apache man, his long hair a braid of pure white down his back, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He rode down into the valley slowly, his hand raised in a sign of peace. He said his name was Tayo. He was a friend of Luca's uncle. He had heard the stories that had drifted through the mountains. A story of a half-blood trapper who had defied a rich white man, a story of a woman who had chosen the wilderness over a gilded cage. He had come not with a warning, but with a welcome. He sat by their fire, sharing their food and smoking a pipe with Luca. He spoke in the Apache tongue, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. June couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was one of respect, of acceptance. Before he left the next morning, he turned to June. His ancient eyes, as dark and sharp as obsidian, studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a look of approval on his weathered face. He said something to Luca in their language. Later, after the old man had disappeared back over the ridge, June asked Luca what he had said. Luca looked at her, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. He said you have a strong spirit. He said you are not a woman who runs. You are a woman who builds. He reached out and took her hand. He was right. The validation from Luca's people was a gift, a final piece of the life they were building falling into place. But one last shadow remained, the shadow of Russ Henley, the threat of the law, the bounty that, for all they knew, still hung over their heads. The answer came from the same wandering trapper who had sold them the chickens. On his next visit, months later, he brought news from the outside world. News of a land dispute in Bisbee that had turned violent. A rich rancher named Russ Henley had been shot and killed by a rival. His empire had crumbled, his hired guns scattered to the wind. June and Luca listened in silence as the trapper told the story. When he was gone, a profound quiet settled over their small homestead. The final thread connecting them to their violent past had been cut. It's over, June said, the words feeling strange and new on her tongue. It's finally over. Luca looked out across their valley, at the garden, at the chickens scratching in the dirt, at the smoke curling from their chimney. It was over a long time ago, he said, the day you decided to stay. That evening, as the sun dipped below the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, June walked down to the creek, the same creek where, a lifetime ago, a desperate girl had made a wild gamble. She slipped her bare feet into the cool water, the same water that had once felt like 1,000 knives, but now felt like a cleansing balm. Luca came and stood beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. They stood in silence, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly. Choosing this? Choosing me? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. When I was a boy, he said, his voice low and filled with an emotion that made her heart ache, my sister Tiva used to sing to the stars. After she was gone, the world went silent for me. For years I heard nothing, no music, no hope. He looked deep into her eyes, his gaze so intense it felt like he was seeing into her soul. Then you came. You were a song I didn't know I remembered. You brought the music back into my life, June. I won't disappear, she whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek. I know, he said, his own voice thick, because our story isn't about running anymore. It's about staying. It's about building. It's about this. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of peace, of promise, of a future they had built with their own two hands, against all odds, in a hidden valley they called home. The quiet play at story was over. The real one, the one filled with chicken scratches and blooming flowers and the quiet hum of a life well-earned, had just begun. Thank you for staying with me through June and Luca's incredible journey. Theirs is a story about courage, about choosing your own family, and about finding peace in a world that gives you none. If this story touched your heart, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows me to keep finding and sharing these powerful stories with all of you. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was June's plan at the creek brave or foolish? I can't wait to read your thoughts. Until next time, take care, and remember that even in the darkest of times, there's always a valley waiting if you're brave enough to find it.